Welcome back, Wellness Warriors, to the Enthusiasm Explorer channel. I'm Caitlin Thompson, and in this video, I'm going to share with you how boundaries in your interpersonal relationships can actually affect your physical health and well-being. What? How is that possible, you may wonder? Those seem like completely two different areas of life. How could they possibly be related? Well, stick around, tune into this video, and I will share with you exactly how they're connected. So if you're at all interested in personal development and growth, you've probably come onto the topic of personal boundaries before. Now, it seems that in our modern day Western culture, the topic of boundaries is not so much really addressed in the way that we are raising our children or teaching our adolescents how to relate to other human beings in this world. And for simplistic purposes, let's just define what a boundary is. So a boundary is literally some sort of differentiation between one thing and another thing. It's where one thing ends and another begins. So a border wall between two countries is a boundary. A rule that you cannot break without consequence is a boundary. The cell wall of an organism is a boundary that differentiates between the inside of the organism and the outside of the organism. So it's pretty simple as a concept as far as what a boundary is. And boundaries are actually really important. They separate things so that life can organize itself into more complex patterns. Otherwise, it would just be all one primordial soup, right? If there was no difference between outside and inside, up or down, me and you, then everything would just be all one soup. And we would not have the diversity and variation and beauty of life that exists. So you can take the same sort of concept and apply it to people and the way people relate to each other. And when there are boundaries between people, this can describe either emotional boundaries or physical boundaries or spiritual boundaries even. But just the fact that there's two different beings being distinguished from one another, and one of them has their own stuff and the other has their own stuff. And sometimes our boundaries can be violated or compromised by other people, where the fact that there is a differentiation between me and you can be overstepped by somebody. And a great example of this is when someone asks you to do something for them and either you have trouble saying no, which is your own issue about drawing and creating a boundary, or they don't accept you saying no without harassing you or manipulating you or being overbearing, etc. So in that example, that is a collapse of a boundary happening where there was a wall saying like, this is as far as you can go, and that wasn't respected, or it wasn't put up in the first place. And in that case, we can only really blame ourselves, right? So what's really fascinating is we also have boundaries in our biology, in our physiology. So some examples of boundaries that are really important for our bodily functions. One is the blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier is this thin membrane around the brain, and its job is to basically decide what goes in and out of the brain. And it's very important because The brain is a very delicate organ. It's susceptible to all sorts of, damage and toxicity by things. And so your body has to protect it and be very discerning about what molecules pass into the brain. So the blood-brain barrier's job is to basically choose which molecules can pass through or not. This is why some drugs can enter into the brain and some drugs can't. Another good example of a boundary in the body is the epithelial layer of the digestive tract, which is very thin, 1 cell long layer, and it literally distinguishes between the inside of the gut and what's going to get absorbed in the gut and go into the bloodstream, which is the body, which is inside the body. So if you think about it, the gut is actually the interface between the outside world and what can enter the body and the actual contained environment of the body. So food that we eat can be covered in bacteria or mold or poisons and stuff, and the digestive system actually decides what is safe to incorporate into the body and allow into the bloodstream. So if there is a toxic bacteria or something of that on your food, your very thin gut barrier layer is supposed to decide and distinguish between what should go into the bloodstream and what shouldn't. So perhaps a bacteria that is seen as a pathogen shouldn't go into the bloodstream because it could cause a blood infection and sepsis and death. So that gives you sort of an idea of these boundaries that exist naturally in the body. Also, we think about organisms. So if you have looked into the microbiome and this, 10 trillion bacteria cells that are living in our digestive tract and other parts of our body, why does the immune system attack pathogenic bacteria but not these bacteria? And what it really comes down to is the body has maintained some sort of boundary, which is probably more far complex than we can really understand, honestly, and has decided that, these bacteria at a certain level are actually considered our friends, they're considered part of our being, and therefore our body tells our immune system not to attack these organisms. However, if there's a pathogenic bacteria, our body will tell our immune system to attack an organism and destroy it. So what's interesting is that some of these bacteria that are considered pathogenic at a certain level are considered commensal good bacteria at another level. So how is it that the same type of bacteria that exists as a certain population size is okay for our body and then maybe grows to a certain extent and then is now considered not okay? And the answer is boundaries. At some point, a bacteria can cross a certain threshold and cross a boundary where our body says, you know what, I no longer feel comfortable with you existing in this quantity or behaving in this way. I'm going to launch an immune response and consider you to be some sort of infection. And that's where it gets really interesting, because you see, the immune system is actually your body's way of differentiating between the self and the other. So I'll repeat that. Your immune system is the way that your body identifies self versus other. So the immune system is a boundary in the body. Okay, so I've talked a little bit about boundaries in relationships, talked about boundaries in our physiology with bacteria and nutrients and chemicals, all sorts of stuff. How are those related? So, one thing that I almost always see in people with leaky guts and leaky blood-brain barriers, and this I forgot to explain, but these barriers that I just described, sometimes they can become leaky. So the gut can become leaky where it starts actually letting in stuff into the bloodstream that it's not supposed to because it's been damaged by bacterial infections, by gluten, by antibiotics, by other toxins, stuff like that. And the same thing can happen to the brain, where stuff that starts seeping into the brain that's not supposed to seep into there because the boundary has been compromised in the physical body. So, what I see consistently is that people that have conditions where these leaky boundaries in the gut, in the blood-brain barrier, etc., they tend to have compromised boundaries not only in their physiology but also in their interpersonal relationships. And this is where it gets really interesting. And I see people with Lyme disease, with Epstein-Barr virus, with herpes, with other pathogenic organisms, and they identify as having this chronic infection of some sort, but yet many people harbor these same organisms in their body, like Lyme disease, like Epstein-Barr virus, etc., that don't have a chronic illness. So what that tells you is that it's actually not so much about the organism itself. It's not the presence of the infectious organism that constitutes what makes someone sick. It is the lack of an appropriate boundary in the body where the body is said, hey, you cannot just move into our space and take our nutrients and take over and push our organisms around and unbalance us. You have to get out of here. And that's the immune system's job, is to say, hey, you guys, they're like the security, basically saying, hey, you guys are causing trouble. Sorry, you can't be doing this here. But when you don't have adequate boundaries in your immune system, in your body's like allowing these organisms to hang out in the hotel room and trash the room. It's kind of the analogy of it is like you've invited them into your house party and they're breaking everything in your house, and instead of being like, hey, you got to get out of here, you're like, oh, but maybe can you not do that? And so what I see consistently is that the people that have these physical boundary issues where they're clearly compromised in their immune system's ability to differentiate between the self and the not self, they also have trouble doing that with people in relationships. And the reason this tends to occur in multiple facets of somebody's life is that you tend to see similar patterning and energetic sort of pattern expression on micro and macro levels. Now, this is where I get a bit trippy with all of this as concepts. If you think about a fractal or a holographic image, basically the image contains all the components of itself, no matter how far you zoom in or zoom out. So the pattern is infinitely maintained no matter how much you zoom in versus out. And it's kind of like that exercise where if you take a glass of water and you keep pouring half of it out and you just keep removing half and half and half and half, the age-old question is, how many times do you have to do that before the water's gone? Well, technically the answer is an infinite amount of times, because there's always going to be at least half left. And then, of course, in practical ways, eventually there will be a negligible amount of water and it'll be as empty as you or I are concerned. But for the sake of mathematical projection, we're thinking about fractals as being infinitely large, infinitely small. And you tend to see the same patterns of this microcosm, macrocosm synergy of patterning in various models of nature, including in our human bodies, and the ways that our cells and the molecules inside of us pattern and express themselves can be synonymous with the way that our organ systems express themselves, the way that we express ourselves as complete people, and the ways that we express ourselves as conglomerates of people in communities, in countries, in cities, on Earth. And it's funny because we see these sort of epidemics of like autoimmune diseases where bacteria are overgrowing and causing inflammation and confusion about what is the self and what's not. And then that's when the body attacks its own tissue because it's confused about what's mine and what's somebody else's. And you kind of see the same thing happening on a global level with the earth. It's like human beings are like the bacterial overgrowth that is compromising the boundaries of the earth to maintain a sense of balance and homeostasis. And what's happening? The earth is literally warming. The earth is literally experiencing inflammation in its global body. So that kind of gives you an idea of how to imagine like the microcosm, macrocosm models that are playing out in biology and just as an overall bigger patterning to the mathematical physics of nature. And this is what we see with people that aren't having good boundaries in their emotional and social relationships with people. And so consistently, what I've also witnessed is when people who have these sort of compromised boundaries work on changing the ways that they relate to other people, guess what? Their guts stop being leaky. Their blood-brain barrier stops being leaky. They start healing from their chronic Lyme disease, from their Epstein-Barr virus infections, from their SIBO, their small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, their Bartonella, Babesia, whatever the organism is. I don't even think it actually really matters most of the time. When they start being able to tell someone no in a kind and loving way, while also honoring themselves in a kind and loving way, they are able to have that action ripple downstream into the microcosm of their physiology, where they're actually repatterning their like electrophysical state of being. It's amazing to witness. And so this is how, when we have firm, loving boundaries with people, it actually changes how our physical boundaries operate in our physical body, which can make all the difference in whether we are healthy or having a chronic disease. And, when we have these boundaries with people, when we start implementing our boundaries by honoring ourselves and saying, no, I can't do this for you. I can't take this on for you. I can't be this for you. I can't be there for you. Whatever it may be, at whatever point you choose to honor yourself over someone else and create that wall that divides and said, this is your shit, this is my shit, that's when your healing can start to truly happen. And not only are you doing yourself a favor by choosing yourself, choosing to nurture your needs first, you're actually helping that other person heal too. The person that you're saying no to, you're helping them heal because chances are that they don't know how to have healthy social boundaries either. And a lot of times when people are overstepping our boundaries, it's because they have the same problem as us. They don't know they don't know how to have good boundaries with people and still being in a loving relationship with them. And so many of us are terrified that if we tell someone no, that they're not going to like us anymore, they're not going to care about us, they're not going to want to be around us, and we're going to lose their love, we're going to lose that connection, we're going to lose their approval, whatever it may be. That fear of us not being good enough to inherently be valued for who we are instead of what we do for others, that is a deeper sickness that we need to look at within ourselves. And like I said, chances are that the person who's not respecting your boundaries doesn't know how to even have their own boundaries respected. It's usually a two-way thing where they just have no concept of what a healthy boundary looks like. So one of the most beautiful gifts that you can give someone is teaching them how a boundary can be held in a loving, kind, and compassionate way, and that you can continue to care about them and want to connect with them even though you have held up a boundary. It's one of the most amazing gifts that you can give someone is set a positive example for them on how healthy, wholesome, happy relationships must have boundaries in them, and that it's absolutely okay to tell someone no and they will still love you for it because you are inherently lovable. So that's the beautiful lesson in all of this for yourself, for me, for the person that you're drawing your loving boundary with. And that shit ripples out and it makes the world a better place. And again, boundaries are not bad, they're beautiful. Boundaries help us be different from one another. Boundaries help us see, the difference between the grass and the sky. They help us appreciate the shape of a flower. They help us see the difference in colors in a sunset. They help us identify that I'm a woman and you're a man and we can come together and make love. Like, do you get what I'm saying? Like, boundaries add color and contrast to this world so that we can appreciate the diversity that existence has to offer. So I hope that you'll see them as something that's really valuable, something that's healing, and something that is important for your physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I know it's a bit long, but I tried to pack it with quite a lot of interesting content and connect it back to each other so that you fully understand why these things are important and how they're related. I love you guys, and be sure to subscribe to my channel if you dig this sort of real talk where I like to empower you guys with as many tools and insightful shares as I can that help inspire you to continue growing, healing, and evolving as the best version of your true self. And I have all sorts of other videos that have tips and tricks on different tools, whether they be nutritional supplements, psychedelics, breath exercises, healing modalities of all sorts, or just positive perspectives that help us understand our lives in a functional way. So be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any of those videos, because I'm just cranking out a toolbox of content for you guys to empower you to be the best, most awesome version of yourselves. I love you. Smile on my warriors. I will catch you next time. Mwah.